So hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our latest webinar, The Next 20 in Energy, Navigating Growth, Reliability, and Reform in the Electricity System. My name is Tom Barbieri. I'm Densky's Director of Communications and Market Engagement. Really happy to welcome you today. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items, which we can see on the next slide. So we'll wait till that comes up. But due to the great turnout, we've disabled the chat. That said, we really encourage folks to submit questions using the Q&A function, which they can find at the bottom of their screen. There'll be a Q&A section later on in the webinar. We invite people to submit questions in English or French. We'll be able to answer those both. And if anyone needs closed captioning, they can turn that on by clicking the little show CC icon at the bottom, and then you'll be able to make some selections there. So before we hand it over to Philippe Densky, I'm going to just go through the agenda quickly. So we'll start with some opening remarks from our founder and president. Next, we'll hand it over to my colleagues Amara, Anirudh, and Ben, and they'll be walking us through our thoughts on the next 20 years in the energy sector. Then we're really pleased to be having a discussion with Hydro-Quebec about all of the work that they're doing. And then we'll wrap it up with about a 10-minute Q&A. So again, we invite folks to submit questions using the Q&A. And without further delay, I'm happy to hand it over to our president, Philippe Densky. Are you still muted?
I'm still muted. All right, there we go. You hear me now? Okay, fantastic. We can get rid of my picture here. Good to see everyone. Thank you everyone for joining us for this. Bear with me. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes for those of you who don't know our firm, just to the shameless elevator pitch view of what we do, and then I'll tee up the conversation here around the supply side. So for those of you who don't know us, we've been around for 20 years now. We're a consulting firm focused exclusively on one thing, and that is accelerating the clean energy transition. So our team is roughly 65 odd professionals. That's full-time in-house professionals. In addition, we have a number of experts who join us for specific projects, but the core team is roughly 65 people. We've delivered on over 1,000 projects in the 20 years since we were founded, and every single one of those 1,000 projects plus is fundamentally about supporting our clients as they navigate and accelerate the clean energy transition. We do that within our firm. We are focused on really both sides of the equation. In other words, the analytics and the strategy. So if you know our team, you'll know that roughly half of our team members are deep, as a quant people. So these are people who are developing running models and crunching the numbers and figuring out what is possible, what is likely, what is possible, at what cost, what benefit. And then the other half are about strategy. They're about taking that potential, taking those numbers and figuring out how can we make it happen, whether it's go-to-market strategies or regulation or otherwise. We do that across all areas of the energy transition, and we do it for clients who fundamentally are governments across North America, utilities across North America, and as well as large corporates and nonprofits, again, across North America. That's really where we play. So that's a little bit of who we are, specifically in the energy space. If you look up top, we focus on both the demand and the supply side of the energy transition equation. So on the demand side, buildings, transportation, and industry. And of course, on the supply side, the energy systems that supply all of those needs. On that supply side, we cover an array of needs or client needs. We assess technologies, so the full bevy of supply and delivery technologies. We do load forecasting, resource planning, decarbonization pathway studies, helping to figure out what is really the best way to get to our end goals and to get through the energy transition out the other side efficiently. We assess markets, do feasibility studies, support our clients on policy and regulatory fronts, develop grid mod strategies, and a whole array of other support. So I didn't want to take too much time going through that, but I did want to do this this quick, shameless summary of the work that that this extraordinary team does. This extraordinary team that I have the privilege of working with every day. Let me just skip over and talk now about the content of this webinar. So this is our third webinar in the series, and this one is really focused on the supply side of the equation, the energy system itself. And I just want to put it into context, really high level. We're in strange times now, and I don't need to go into that too much. Obviously, the politics of the day are changing rapidly, but the thing that's not changing, the thing that is pretty much bedrock, certainly to my mind, is that we are in the midst of a fundamental historical transition of our energy systems, the systems that supply the foundation of our economies, the foundation of our societies, the system that provides heat and power and propulsion and process to our buildings, our industries, and our vehicles. That is in the process of changing. And politics aside, there will be ebbs and flows. There will be setbacks along the way. In some places it'll be a bit longer, and others a little bit shorter. But ultimately, we know that when we jump 30 years from now, one single generation from now, we will be looking back at this period as the period in which we oversaw a fundamental shift in our energy systems. And that fundamental shift at its core is about the interplay, or about the ratios, if you will, of fossil fuels on the one hand and electricity on the other. And I'm grossly oversimplifying here, but sometimes it helps to simplify. Our current system is primarily primarily supplied by fossil fuels directly. Electricity plays an important complement to that system. If you're in Canada or the US, electricity is going to be roughly a fifth to a quarter of all of the energy needs. Fossil fuels are pretty much the rest. That's the current system. The system that we're moving to is one where electricity is at the core of the system. Electricity is the dominant player, and it will be complemented by fossil fuels, preferably fossil fuels that have carbon capture, by hydrogen, by biomass sources. So in other words, it will be complemented by molecules, but the primary driver of the future energy system will be electricity. And ultimately, the question that we have, and the question that this firm is focused on day in, day out, and has been for 20 years, is how do we unlock the role of clean power affordably and reliably? And that's really critical. So not just any way. How do we do it affordably? How do we do it reliably? And how do we also do it while harnessing the clean fuels, the molecules, where appropriate? So don't want to negate the important complementary role of clean molecules in all of this. Ultimately, that's the transition that we're in. That's the transition that we're focused on, and that is the challenge that we have today. And the purpose of the conversation today is to talk a little bit about how can we make this transition happen in a timely manner, in an affordable manner, in a reliable manner. With that, I'm going to pass it on to my teammates, starting with Amara, who's going to talk through some of our perspectives on this critical issue of the day. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Philippe, and hi everyone. My name is Amara, and I'm a consultant with Dunsky. And I spend a lot of my time helping utilities, planners, and governments understand exactly this question. So where is load, where is demand for electricity going? And not only that, but fundamentally, what does this mean for our systems? So I'm going to spend the next few minutes walking you through some of our insights from this work. But first, I want to start off by just kind of setting the stage for the challenge that our electricity system is facing over the next 20 years. And it's characterized by three main factors. The first is continuing to decarbonize our existing supply. So we have made significant strides in this over the past 2 decades. In Canada, for example, between 2000 and 2020, the emission intensity of electricity dropped by half and is now on average more than 80% emissions free. However, over the next 2 decades, we're going to need to continue decarbonizing the remainder of this existing supply, and also recognize that this challenge will not be faced equally by everyone. So in other countries, as well as in specific states and provinces, it's not 80% emissions free. It's significantly lower, and there's farther to go. So this is still going to be a significant challenge that we're facing over the next 20 years. The second is not only decarbonizing existing supply, but also growing supply. So increasing demands for electricity mean that supply will have to double or even triple over the next 20 to 25 years, which means growing our supply by 2 to 7% per year on average. We have done this before as well. So between 1950 to 2000, there was significant growth in electricity generation of around 5% per year on average. But we do have now the dual challenge of doing both of these things together. So, decarbonizing and growing at the same time. And this is while also, as Philippe mentioned, critically ensuring that we're maintaining system affordability and reliability, which will be just a critical ingredient to ensuring that we are successful in facing the challenge before us. Now, some of the key emerging drivers of this load growth can be categorized across 4 main elements. The first is transportation, building, and industry electrification. As Philippe mentioned, electricity is really moving towards becoming central to our energy system, and with this will come electrification of many sectors and end uses. These are, some things that we have been talking about for a while now, but over the next 20 years will really start to become material and have significant impact on our systems. We're seeing this already today with electrification of passenger transportation, for example, where across some provinces, we're reaching up to 25% of new vehicle sales being electric vehicles. But over the next 20, 25 years, we're going to also see significant electrification of medium and heavy duty vehicles, for example, continuing electrification of heating, as well as increasing electrification of certain industries. The next emerging driver of load growth that is critical to taking into account and understanding how our systems are going to evolve in the future is the growth of AI and cloud computing needs, which in turn is driving an increasing need for data centers, which are extremely energy intensive. And recent forecasts project that in the US, for example, energy demand from data centers alone could increase by 3 times over just the next 3 years, so by 2028. Now, there is some uncertainty as to how this trajectory will continue in the long term and what the pace and scale will be out to 2050. But it is clear that especially in the short term, this is coming and coming quickly and will have impacts on our system that we need to be taking into account. Beyond AI and data centers alone, there are also other emerging new economic opportunities and industries that will have implication for load growth in the future. So the first of this, this can be divided into, I would say, 2 main categories. The first being growth in industries related to the clean energy transition. So one example of this is growth in battery and electric vehicle manufacturing, for example, where we've seen significant investment and development of this across North America in recent years. Another area that can drive growth is the emerging trend of onshoring and friendshoring, driven by supply chain issues and geopolitics. This has been really a key trend in North America in recent years. And as we continue to increase domestic production, mining, manufacturing, this will also have implications on our energy system and drive load growth, and is another key trend to keep an eye on over the next years. And the final is clean fuel production. So although electricity will be kind of emerging as central to our energy system, clean fuels definitely have a niche but still very important role to play in supporting with decarbonization in areas that might be too costly or too difficult to electrify. We have many options at our disposal here for clean fuels. This could be composed of biofuels, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, synthetic fuels even, and there are multiple production pathways by which these can be produced, not all of which require significant electricity. However, some of these pathways do have significant implications on electricity demand, if we think of electrolytic hydrogen, for example. So this is another trend driving increasing demands on the electricity system. Now, we've seen that demand for electricity is growing and is projected to increase by 2 to 3x by 2050. But besides just this growth in demand, taking a more nuanced view, what does this really mean for our systems? And we've been really helping our clients, utilities and planners to understand exactly that question. And based on this, we see three key dynamics that are going to be important in the coming years. The first is shifts in peak season. So this is particularly important for areas in colder climates, for example, most of Canada and the northern US, where the combined impact of both heating electrification and vehicle electrification are expected to drive summer peaking systems to winter peaking, potentially within the next 3 to 5 years, depending on the trajectory and uptake of these technologies. The next is evolving peak windows and system load shapes. So these new emerging loads don't necessarily have the same dynamics and load shape as our baseline, and this can drive changes in, for example, the peak window, where in the figure here, for example, we see a system which previously had a single evening peak window shifting towards a system with 2 peak windows, one in the morning driven by heating electrification predominantly, and then one in the evening driven by vehicle electrification. This is just one example, and of course it will look different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Other trends to consider are with increasing load from data centers and industry, a potential for flatter peaks and load shapes. And finally, there's going to be non-homogeneous distribution of these impacts. So depending on, for example, market composition and demographics, uptake of some of these emerging technologies will not be consistent across the system and could drive pockets of the system, for example, specific substations or feeders that see the impacts of load growth either earlier or more significantly than others. And this will be another factor that's really critical to take into account as we are preparing to meet the challenge ahead of us in the coming years. And so given all of these changes, all of these new emerging drivers of load and the implications that it can have for our systems, there's really a need right now and in the coming years to evolve our load forecasting practices to ensure that we are equipping utilities, planners, and governments with the tools that they need to plan for and accommodate these changes. And throughout our work, there are 3 main factors that we're considering as emerging best practices to support in preparation and understanding of this new load and changes for the electricity system. The first is right-sizing temporal and spatial granularity of our forecasts. So considering the appropriate temporal granularity, for example, looking at typical peak days or even hourly forecasts is really critical for capturing these changes in system dynamics, for being able to take into account the coincidence or not of some of these different emerging loads and understand how does this really shake out when everything is taken into account together. And the second factor is right-sized spatial granularity. I mentioned, of course, that these impacts are going to be non-homogeneous and we may see specific impacts in pockets of the distribution system at substation or feeder level. And within this context, there's also going to be an increasingly important role for distribution planning and distribution utilities. So looking, not only at a bulk system-wide load forecast, but how does this disaggregate for individual components of the system is really critical as we move ahead. The second is holistic forecasts that cover all of the emerging areas of load growth that I just discussed, as well as any trends, drivers due to just population growth or other classical drivers of load growth. And this, again, is just really critical for ensuring that we're understanding the full system dynamics, moving away from kind of silos, looking at only electric vehicles or only heating alone, and ensuring that we are capturing all of these emerging areas of growth and the risk and uncertainty associated with them. And the final is evaluating both unmitigated and mitigated trajectories for load growth. So I have mainly focused here on drivers of load growth, but of course, there are also significant opportunity for load modifiers, such as distributed energy resources, which can help to mitigate some of the impacts of this growth. However, in order to really be able to properly value these resources and plan for and evaluate them on a level playing field with other resources and solutions that we have at our disposal, it is first essential to understand unmitigated load growth. So really, these two in parallel are critical components of load forecasting moving forward. And with that, I'm going to be passing it on to my colleague Anirudh, who's going to be talking more about some of these emerging resources and how we're going to meet this growth in electricity demand.
Perfect. Thank you, Amara. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anirudh Kshemendranath, and I'm a senior consultant at Danske. I worked over a decade in the energy space, where I've supported policymakers, utilities, and energy developers assess the role, the potential, and the key challenges that lie ahead for DERs and utility scale systems. Now, building on the insights that Amara has shared, together we'll explore the different emerging resources that will shape the future of our energy landscape. So, the road to a reliable, affordable, and clean grid faces three key headwinds. First, our electric demand is expected to double or even triple by 2050. And all this is happening at a time when a significant portion of our grid is reaching the end of its useful life. Today, 70% of our transmission lines are over 25 years, and NERC estimates that about 115 gigawatts of generation capacity will retire over the next decade. To compound to this issue, over 85% of the new generation capacity in the current interconnection queue is largely made up of variable generation resources, and they lack key reliability attributes. These three factors will make capacity shortfall and grid reliability the biggest concerns for the electric sector over the next 20 years. And to address them, we need a fundamental shift in how we plan to scale our energy supply. Now, fortunately, we have three tools at our disposal. They are distributed energy resources, long-duration energy storage, and clean fuels. Distributed energy resources are often seen as a threat to grid reliability, especially when we take a very myopic perspective that load growth from electrification of end users and the two-way power flow from customer-sided solar. However, to borrow an expression, what stands in the way becomes the way. DER is not an obstacle, but a solution for managing the challenges ahead. First, DERs can meet emerging system needs by addressing the electric demand at the source. They can help mitigate peak demand, defer infrastructure upgrades, and support the balancing of the grid. Second, given the magnitude of the challenge ahead, compared to traditional solutions, they're very cost-effective, quick to deploy, and they can be right-sized to minimize overbuild risk while being a scalable solution. And third, most importantly, they empower the customer to play an active role in managing their electric demand. Thus, DERs are shifting the utility business models to be more customer-centric, and utilities are increasingly recognizing the shift and actively planning for DERs. Now, one such instance is when, for the IESO, we dug deep into this question as to how DERs can meet Ontario's needs. We did a comprehensive assessment of behind the meter and front of the meter resources that are expected to emerge over the next 10 years. We quantified their achievable potential and their contribution to system needs. And what we found is that across different scenarios, DERs can reduce system peaks by up to 5 to 15%. And to unlock that potential, utilities and system operators need to plan for DERs as a resource and not just a load modifier. Second, to enable the DER participation through innovative market mechanisms, programs, and rates, and at the same time, integrate them through grid modernization efforts. Now, while DERs will play a very critical role in managing demand, we will still need large-scale utility resources to meet our future needs. And as our generation mix diversifies and evolves, we will need long-duration storage for a more reliable and clean grid. So long-duration storage enhances reliability by making renewables more reliable and dispatchable. Second, when paired with renewables, it becomes a very cost-effective solution to address these reliability challenges. And third, as a portfolio product, it supports a diverse mix of generation resources and hedges against the challenges with respect to planning, supply, or deployment. But despite these concrete values that LDES provides, it is still missing in system plans. And there are three key reasons for that. First, most planning studies often exclude LDES or do not model them accurately with respect to its full value and benefits. Second, our current market and regulatory structures do not compensate LDES appropriately. For instance, a 10-hour long-duration product would be undervalued in a 4-hour capacity market. And third, LDES is not a single technology, but a portfolio of solutions with varying characteristics and performance indicators. And this adds to the complexity of modeling this technology. However, despite these key barriers, LDES resources are gaining momentum. For instance, in California, they've targeted a 2 gigawatt LDES procurement by 2037. In Australia, particularly New South Wales, they've revised their targets from 16 gigawatt hours to 28 gigawatt hours by 2034. And here home in Ontario, we launched a long-term RFP to procure about 1 gigawatt of LDES by 2035. We have also done an opportunity assessment for LDES in Ontario and found that 6 gigawatt of LDES could be cost-effective by 2032. Now, the tools that we covered will provide the backbone for a low-carbon grid, but they are not enough on their own. In certain conditions, we will still need physical fuels to support grid reliability, especially as extreme weather becomes more frequent and severe. Now, clean fuels such as low-carbon hydrogen, renewable natural gas, SAF, biofuel will support system reliability by offering dispatchable power, especially when variable generation resources are unavailable or when the grid conditions are stressed. Second, they can alleviate some of the burden on the electric system by enabling the deep decarbonization of heavy-duty transportation or even supporting dual-fuel heating. But when we look at the significant benefits, we must also understand the key challenges and constraints. First, there will be a competing demand for clean fuels, which may limit its availability for grid reliability. Second, the production of the fuels themselves could impose a strain on the system and further exacerbate our capacity constraints and result in increased infrastructure demands. Therefore, we need a more integrated approach that looks at the role, the potential, and the constraints of clean fuels as we continue to decarbonize both our electric system and the wider economy. Thank you. And now I'll hand it over to Ben to talk more about planning.
Thank you, Anirudh. So I just want to talk a little bit about planning in the context of what Anirudh and Amara and Philippe have all said. So Philippe came in and said, look, electricity is the center, right? It's the core of the decarbonization that we're looking for. Amara talked about the challenges that we had with load growth and the sort of new technologies and the new approaches that we're seeing in terms of how that's impacting the electricity system and how we need to anticipate demand, whether it's mitigated or unmitigated. Then Anirudh came in and talked about our potential for using DERs as a scalable solution and how long duration energy storage as part of a storage portfolio has gaps in modeling and gaps in planning, but is part of the solution. And so I want to talk specifically about the gaps in planning and where we are today. So where we are today, our research has highlighted that there's increasingly divergence between the way that utilities are planning in their IRPs and what we see in long-term pathways decarbonization studies. The IRPs tend to inform short-term decisions, and they end up having resources that are not specified within the IRP portfolio that is going to be some future resource they rely on. Whereas in the long duration or long-term energy pathway studies, we see resources that are not tested in the same rigor that you would have within a utility IRP, making sure that they are operational and reliable. So in our current system, we see inconsistency in the way that the scope and policy and assumption and timelines have been there. We see growth that is about half of what we would see within the net zero studies and IRPs. And we really see an increasing uncertainty around what is the right mix of resources to build out, to take forward, to make sure that we have a reliable system that can also meet the clean energy transition. And that's where we want to say, what is the future that we need when we're planning? And to me, the future requires that we have an integrated, robust, and resilient planning. And that is that we can leverage the clean, abundant energy that we get where those opportunities lie. We can prioritize reliability and affordability. And we can also enable the growth and opportunity that we see from having a more robust electric system and electric grid that is ready to respond. And so what is the aspect of the plans that we see that can help us get there? Well, they need to be prepared. So we're planning for a future grid. We need to be prepared for the changes that are coming at us. The planning processes and approaches that were effective in the past have to evolve to meet future challenges. We have to manage uncertainty, making sure that we can invest in options and flexibility and make sure that we're there to alleviate the emerging system constraints. And we need to make sure that we remove the blinders from planning. We don't want to any longer plan for one system in isolation and over-optimize just the electric system or just the natural gas system or just the fuels that we would anticipate for the clean fuels that Anirudh and Amara both referenced. Rather, we want to look at a holistic plan. So from our perspective, when we're looking for what those plans should look like, we have some characteristics of planning that we really want to highlight and that we have been assisting people in bringing forward. We want to make sure that when you're going out and planning for the clean energy transition, exemplary planning, the best planning out there, takes into account multiple fuels. It looks not just at electricity, not just at gas or renewable natural gas, not just at clean fuels. It looks at the entire spectrum. It's integrated from all the different layers of planning, going from the supply side, where you're looking at generation and what are the resources that we can use, down to the distribution system and everything in between. It's comprehensive. It doesn't just consider supply side or demand side, but it considers every possible technology that can be brought to bear in decarbonization. It's robust. We definitely want to see scenario-based and risk-based analysis, ensuring that decisions remain effective across a wide range of outcomes. We don't know the future. We want to make sure that we plan for something that can be very adaptable to different futures. And finally, we want to make sure that it's resilient. It provides reliable electricity and recovers quickly from extreme events that are driven by climate change or other things that we want to be prepared for and make sure that the system is ready to support the future and make sure people can rely on it. So with that, I want to bring on one of our guests. So we have Joël Thibert from Hydro-Québec. He's joining us today to speak a little bit about Hydro-Québec. I would like to give him a quick introduction. In his role, Joël is responsible for the utility's Center for Expertise in Energy Economic Transition, along with Hydro-Québec's activities related to integrated energy planning as well as the development of corporate strategies. He also works closely with the government of Quebec on issues related to the energy transition. For those of you unfamiliar with Hydro-Quebec, although I'm sure most of you on the line are, it's one of the largest electric utilities in North America, managing the generation, distribution, and transmission of electricity in Quebec. Close to 100% of the electricity Hydro-Quebec distributes is generated from renewable resources. Hydro-Quebec has one of the most ambitious energy transition investment plans, including 170 billion of investment over the next 12 years. Nearly 20 gigawatts of nameplate capacity is going to be installed. About 5,000 kilometers of new wires will be put up. And there was a recent announcement that Hydro-Quebec intends to accelerate all of this investment that is incredibly ambitious. And with that, thank you, Joel, so much for joining us. I hope that
Thanks
was
for
an
having me.
adequate introduction to
Oh, sure.
amazing efforts
And-
Hydro-Quebec is making.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't just wish Dunsky a happy birthday. This is really a momentous occasion. So thanks for having me, and congratulations on all the influence you've had as a company on the trajectory of the energy transition. It's good. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you so much. So I have a few prepared questions, but I think we'd like to eventually get to the questions from the audience. So
Sure.
let me just start off asking you a little bit about load growth. So we know that the electrification of buildings and transportation industry is going to be a key driver of load growth. We talked about that a little bit earlier in the presentation, but the timing and pace is going to remain pretty uncertain. So what is Hydro-Quebec doing right now to really monitor what's going on the ground and prepare for that uncertainty of when you're going to see the load coming onto your system?
So I'm glad to have listened to Amar's presentation now, because I feel like we're not too far off the mark. So of course we do, to begin with, parametric load growth or demand forecasting, right? That looks at population growth, industrial growth, demand patterns that are shifting, electric vehicle ownership, all that sort of stuff at a substation level. And we do it every year. Of course, these things don't change very much year over year. And that's mainly used for infrastructure plan, right? To make sure that we understand when a substation will be overloaded and kind of what the investments that are coming up are. But of course, that doesn't quite answer your question, which is, what do you do about those shortened disturbances that are happening and that we hear about, read on the news? And so we're trying to separate, and you can tell me whether that's a right approach or not, the medium long-term planning from the very short-term planning, which does take into account not just what's happening in the environment around us right now, politically, economically, but also looking at specific projects that we have. I mean, when I say projects, industrial clients that are supposed to come online over the next 5 years, and actually looking at how likely is it that they'll actually come online at that date, because it makes a difference, right? And really then doing a very short-term, more realistic scenario of the next 3 years. It seems like a reasonable thing to me to separate both, because when we think 25 years, we need to be a little bit agnostic as to what's going to happen geopolitically, and really focus on the heavy tendencies, versus preparing for the next 3 years, where we have to be very agile and really think of, okay, what are the things that are affecting us now, right? In terms of also exports, imports, things of that sort. And the one other thing I'd say, this is something that we're uniquely positioned to do, is we work with the government to try and bend the curve. So not obviously, the next 18 months, but we have some influence. And so we can try and influence public policy to make sure that if we see a demand vector that wasn't anticipated or is potentially going to cause us to become very tight in our electricity availability, then we can try to influence, right, the government, for example, working with them on the building code, and what should we do to make sure that future residential growth is less of a let's say, it creates less load growth than past residential growth. If that makes sense.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I think that leads really well into the next question I was going to ask you about demand side resources. I mean, obviously, this is a massive amount of electricity that's going to be coming onto the system. And you have to be prepared on the supply side, but you also need to be thinking about demand side resources, whether that's demand response, energy efficiency, distributed generation, all those pieces. And I'm just wondering like how you're putting those into your plans looking forward. I mean, I think your characterization of short term and blended into the long term is perfect, right? You have to have those near term strategies and the long term strategies. But when you're looking out and planning for the next 20 years, kind of as we're theming this, like how are you seeing demand side working into that? And then, you know, what role is there for beyond energy efficiency, just talking about like the most efficient place to spend kind of the energy budget that
That's a great question. So I'll start by just reminding people who maybe aren't familiar with our plan that between now and 2035, it's 21 terawatt hours and about 3,500 megawatts of demand response. And like, so respectively of energy efficiency and demand response, that we're, you know, as part of the overall plan, right? Which is in the order of 60 terawatt hours and around 9 to 11,000 megawatts. So quite a big chunk of our plan is actually on the demand side. And I believe actually Dunsky has helped us with, you know, fleshing out those targets. So you guys are very familiar with this. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this, because of course, Quebec's a relatively small jurisdiction, big in land, but small in population. You know, it's 500,000 smart thermostats, 1 million heat pumps, and, you know, upwards of 100,000 kind of, you know, houses we need to equip with solar panels, starting from a low base, right? And all in the next 10 years. So again, relative to our size, which is, you know, we have 4 million houses in this province, it's a lot of, it's a massive undertaking. We are not, as a public utility, we're not in the business of installing heat pumps. So we need to really leverage the ecosystem to reach those targets. So I'm quite glad that I'm not responsible for delivering all of them personally, because they are super ambitious, but they need to be, because I think we can't ask the population to, you know, make a lot of the other sacrifices that will be required eventually if we haven't done a really good job at that. So that's why I think, you know, when you asked about the kind of other non-traditional solutions, look, I'm relatively new to my role, but I, of course, read a lot. I talk to a lot of people, and, you know, things that I think we're all thinking of is looking, for example, at our neighbors in the US, the Brooklyn Queens demand management program. Like, there's novel ways of saying, okay, so what if we offered more money to people around a particular substation to basically do demand response instead of, or to defer, you know, large investments? We're in the process of assessing those. And I'll be perfectly frank, it's still early days. Like, we haven't really thought that way, I think, traditionally. And so, but we are incorporating those into our thinking. And so, yeah, could we go further? Of course, but and I think to address your question specifically, what's the challenging part for us is we need to make sure, because there's so much investment we need to do, right? You mentioned earlier, affordability and reliability are really, really important. So we need to say, okay, so could we go further in demand response? Yes, but at what cost? And then what is that, let's say, transform that into an LCOC, that cost per megawatt they're able to do, you know, to get from this kind of solution? What are the alternatives, right? And so that's the fun part of this job, is to try and put all of those things on an equal footing, to say, maybe at some point doing more demand response doesn't make sense economically and something else does. And so we're in, you know, doing that on virtual power plants, similar concept. The private sector comes and says to us, oh, you know, we could provide you with a 2-hour, you know, demand response program for, you know, peak hours. And what we have to ask ourselves as a utility is, what is that worth to us? What is 2 hours worth to us? Typically, we're looking for 6, 8, 10 hours, but we need to start getting very granular as to, these things are worth something, but we need to know how much to pay for them, right? Because by law, we can't pay more for service than it's, you know, than the, let's say, avoided cost that the service allows us to capture. So we're very much in the midst of that. We're open to all ideas, right? That are, of course, clean energy, you know, that involve either demand response or clean energy options. But, you know, we have to be careful, because there's not infinite dollars. And again, we need to make sure it's affordable, right? You said it several times. It's a key to our plan. We cannot impose costs that will make then, electricity affordable and then break the social contract we have with the rest of Quebec.
Yeah, I definitely look at every solution brought to the table as kind of like the critical thing that we're seeing coming out of a lot of trends in North America. But, personally, I've been around planning for over
Yes.
15, almost 20 years now. And like the tools that we've used in the past to do planning have been pretty constrained, and they really need to evolve. And like, I'm just curious, like, what is Hydro-Quebec doing to really evolve your planning methods to like bring all this together, to be able to bring kind of your
Yeah.
supply side ambition and all the things. And when you talk about 9 to 11,000 megawatts, that's capacity like on the system. You need more than that, in terms of resources that you're building to be able to respond
Yes.
to it. Like,
Right.
how do you see your planning evolving to deal with all these things that need to come together and like work in concert?
So maybe for just a bit of history for people who don't know Hydro-Quebec that well, when we sort of opened our market or joined the US, like the US market in the 90s, to become FERC compliant, Hydro-Quebec became like 3 separate businesses and was run like that for the last, up until 2021, 2022. So the culture of actually integrated planning in the sense of generation, transmission, distribution is relatively new. So that's one thing to know. And the other is, we've all, for the past 25 years, we've been, of course, importing, exporting electrons across, our border with Ontario, Massachusetts. I'm not Massachusetts directly because we don't have a border, but Maine, New York, and so on. So we've been doing these things, but I think now our thinking is evolving to actually think of our planning as a Northeast, US, like North America, Northeast of the continent, kind of a broader than geographical scope. So that's number one. And so we really are trying to take a broader view of our business environment to make sure that we consider all those things, because all the moving parts affect us, right? And we affect them. The second, and I think it resonated earlier what you said, is really moving from a deterministic planning to a scenario planning mindset. Of course, there's always been some of that, but I think we have to kind of step that up one level and have more scenarios than we did before and be quite agile at kind of reviewing them constantly. So it's less of a linear process that we do once a year with a very definite answer. It's a continuous process of reviewing our hypotheses based on the evolving landscape. And, even the cost of different resources, right? The cost of solar, as we all know, is changing rapidly. And so we need to stay abreast of that because those things will influence the answer. So that's super exciting for me, of course, because I'm now just joining Hydro-Quebec, but it's I think the teams are really motivated by that because it means planning is a much more central role strategically in the company. The third thing I would say is risk-wise. So of course, we manage water-related risks. Like we're in the business of transforming water into electricity, right? So the company has been very, very good at that forever, right? Because it's our core business. What we are less good at, and I think getting better at, is looking at climate risks and really thinking resilience and what is a business case resilience and being able to actually think long term. For us, that's, forest fire smoke actually is a huge deal for us in terms of how effective our system is, but also freezing rain for those who are from this part of the world. It used to basically be a phenomenon from in the south of the province, but now it's all over. We're seeing it in places we never saw it before. And so we're just expanding our view of risk and then building scenarios around those, which is also, I think, something that it is exciting and quite necessary. And the last thing I would say is just pushing the boundaries of, like, our strategic plan used to be 5 years, now they're 10 years, and our kind of electric plan used to be 10 years, now it's 20, 25 years. So we're just trying to, imagine what the implications of decarbonization mean, like further away, and kind of in as far as the time horizon, because we need to also make sure that, again, we keep the reliability and affordability metrics, right? Long term, what will be the impact on the energy wallet, not just in 5 years, but in 25 years? because those things become really important, right? As we want to communicate our plan to the public. And then one last thing, and you know this because you're based here, but our government now is taking kind of a broader view, even, right? An energy view, not just an electric view of this. And we're of course partnering with them, but it's really important that we influence them and them us. But this is what I like about it is it's a very timely discussion, and it's meant to be a societal debate, right? We need to have these conversations as a society because there are no silver bullets, right? There's no easy path. I mean, sorry, I hope that I'm not sounding like a like a downer here, but every pathway involves trade-offs, right? And we just need to be very good at explaining what those are. We can decide to exclude a certain resource for whatever reason, but then we need to be able to articulate what does it mean for the rest, right? And what kinds of additional efforts will we need to actually undertake? So it's a lot of the things you mentioned. As far as tools, interestingly, many of the tools existed. It's actually about consolidating them into one, and it's interesting. So it's not so much for us that we miss it, the tools we're missing. I think it's in the insights we got from the tools and what we asked them to do. That's what's different. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I do definitely want to get to the Q&A from the audience, but I think there's one more thing that I'd be remiss not to ask.
Sure.
You talked about a lot of risks, but of course, there's been a pretty big policy shift within the US and in terms of how it has been impacting clean energy. Hydro-Quebec has a lot of ties into the industry. I'm just wondering, do you anticipate, and maybe beyond just your experience with Hydro-Quebec, you have a long history in the industry that predates Hydro-Quebec. Do you anticipate that the momentum of the energy transition is going to be impacted by that policy shift if we're going to really see a complete change in direction, or kind of what are the impacts in North America going to be? I suspect if I didn't ask that, somebody in our Q&A would have asked it. So yeah. I figure it's best to just jump to it.
For sure. And I think it's the elephant in the room. Let's call it out, right? The recent change in the US or the White House administration's view of clean energy, of course, is I don't think was unexpected, but was quite sudden, right? But I think, and this is really, really important, right? This is a long-term societal and generational project. It's not a 5-year project. It's a 25, 50-year project. And so I want to just echo what Philippe said. There's no turning back. And I think the way to separate the signal from the noise here is, or the wheat from the chaff, is to look at what people are saying, but then where the money is going, right? Money speaks. And actually, if you look at and by no means I'm suggesting that everything's going in the same direction, but there are some really notable things. Price of copper being one. As we all know, copper is no longer an indication of just economic, let's say, well-being. It's very, very linked to the energy transition. And the copper prices have not dropped massively since Trump's election. In fact, they're quite stable. I think it's a really good bellwether of what's really going on, because that's, in the end, it's the commodity that's behind a lot of this. Another would be, I just love, recent, many of you, of course, would have heard this. So the CEO of Xcel Energy being one of the, largest utilities in the renewable space. And they've basically said, no, we're doubling down. We're going to spend $4 billion in renewables in the next few years. So there's a lot of these very telling signals that investors are not turning their back on the energy transition, because they understand that it makes economic sense to begin with, but also that there's it's a long-term trend, right? That you're betting on the next 25 years, not just the next 5 years. So that'd be my response. I think our view is it's not only to our advantage, but we feel like we need to double down. Like when times become a little bit uncertain, and this is what our CEO said a few days ago to the business community here, is it's the time to actually double down, accelerate, instead of cower back and feel uncertain. So we're very bullish on this. Of course, are we a little bit ahead potentially of the curve? Who knows? I guess time will tell, but we don't feel like it changes anything. If anything, actually, it means we need to go faster to take advantage of the fact that there's suddenly manufacturing capacity for our transformers and other components that are critical to our system.
Excellent. With that, I would love to bring on Amara. I don't know
Sure.
how much time we have, but Amara, if you could, you've been monitoring the Q&As that are coming in, and if you could jump in and give us at least one of the top Q&As that you've been seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, we won't have time to get to all the questions, but there's a few good ones that have come in. And one I think we can start off with is related to data centers. So I touched on this in my section as, one of the emerging drivers of load growth. And we are seeing this emerge as, a major potential consumer of electricity. So wondering, what is Hydro-Quebec's strategy on data centers and potentially other, disruptive new demands that might be coming onto the system?
Thank you for the question. And for the time being, like the answer might not be fully satisfying to you. So the approach we're taking is looking at every project and evaluating on its own merits, because what our read of the environment so far is that not all data centers are born equal, right? Some are more critical, some create more jobs, some are located in places where it makes more sense. So we're trying to assess them in terms of what will they contribute to our society, right? It's a tough one because we may be seen as not having a coherent strategy, but it's actually, for us, it's project by project for now. So no blanket yes or no, I guess, right? Some are good, probably better than others, depending on, what kinds of benefits they bring. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question then.
Sure.
Just checking through. So yeah, okay, I think this one would also be interesting. We've talked a lot about kind of need for increasing supply and increasing demand on the electricity system. And so to what extent do you see, in Hydro-Quebec's case, and maybe some of my other colleagues from Dunsky can also touch on this, the need for grid upgrades to accommodate these, changes, both to enable increased supply
100%.
and demand?
Yeah, and again, this is where the triangle between affordability, reliability, and growth, we need to balance those out. It's my everyday work to make sure that we're not overbuilding, but that we are, maintaining a level of reliability for the system. So we're using the excuse, quote unquote, or the trigger of, let's say, the fact that we're growing to accelerate some overdue maintenance and kind of sustaining CapEx. But yes, there are grid upgrades, and fear not, every time we think of an upgrade, our engineers think, okay, what can we do better? Can we make it more resilient for the future in terms of climate and so on? So 100%. And I think we're of course super on top of that because we're integrated. But I think for the US, there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen. Like, how quickly can we update the grid to match the pace of the transition? Very much top of mind for our counterparts that south of the border. Yeah,
absolutely.
I think Tommy just came on. I believe that means that we are probably out of time, but I do want to say just thank you so much, Joao, for joining us. This has been fantastic. Tommy, I suspect that means I'm supposed to turn it over to you now to lead us out.
Yeah, I'll lead everyone out. Thanks again, Ben, and thank you so much, Joel. Again, we really appreciate your expertise and your time today. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who joined us. Thank you to all of our speakers, not just Joel, but my colleagues Amara, Ben, and Anirudh. Their contact information is up on screen in case anyone would like to get in touch. We'll be sharing a recording of this next week, so you can look for that. And I do want to mention on March 18th, Dunsky will be holding its 4th webinar in this series, which is the next 20 years of the energy transition in Quebec. That will take place in French. But again, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate everybody's time. We wish everyone a great day, and see you soon. Bye-bye.